Good morning, everyone. My name is Brian Preleski. I'm the New Britain State's Attorney. 6 months ago, Edward Gendron was shot and killed in his home by a Waterbury police officer during a well-being check. The report issued today finds that use of force to have been justified under Connecticut law. That is all it means. It does not mean that everything about this incident went well. It does not mean that things couldn't have been done better, and of course it doesn't mean that this is anything but a terrible tragedy for Mr. Gendron's loved ones. Let me begin by saying a few words about Mr. Gendron. While I did not know him, one thing that is clear to me is that he was a man well and truly loved by his family and friends. He was a hard-working man who, at the time of this incident, was disabled as a result of a workplace accident and subsequent surgeries. He had no criminal history, and he lived his life as all of us hope to live our lives, with many loving family members and friends surrounding him. His death is a terrible loss, an irreparable tear in the fabric of so many lives. And that's why, in part, we've decided to speak to all of you today. The investigation of a police officer who uses deadly force must be thorough, timely, and transparent. In terms of transparency, consistent with my past practice, the entire investigative file will be open for review to anyone who wishes to review it. This includes all of the police reports, statements given, forensic reports, police dispatches, and everything that I relied on in making my determination. In terms of thoroughness, you'll be the judge of that. What I can tell you is that based upon my experience, I'm satisfied that I had all of the information needed to make the determination that I was required by law to make. Finally, in terms of timeliness, I provided a detailed timeline of events. I know that there is great frustration over the length of time these reports take to prepare. It's my hope that the addition of a timeline to this report helps to explain why these are lengthy, methodical investigations. The report speaks for itself in terms of its conclusions concerning the use of deadly force. I do wish to say a few words about future actions that should be considered. When someone is killed by a police officer, we have to consider what might have been done differently. Not only what could have reduced the likelihood of this happening, but what could have assisted in the investigation. This goes back to thoroughness and transparency. In that regard, I point out that body cameras would have certainly provided more certainty concerning these events. I know that body cameras are not a panacea. In particular, they can be turned off. That's why it's so important for us to consider the adoption of existing technology that senses when an officer's firearm is unholstered and automatically turns on that officer's body cameras as well as the cameras of surrounding officers. I know that this is an expensive proposition, but I think that we all recognize that we're in a moment that allows Connecticut to be a national leader in this regard. There are few things more transparent than body and dash cam footage. In terms of thoroughness, I'm compelled to address the refusal of the only other Waterbury officer on scene at the time of this shooting to be interviewed. And I want to make it clear that when I say on scene, I don't believe that that Waterbury officer was in the unit where Mr. Gendron was killed. I believe that he was outside of the unit at the time of the shooting. While I'm satisfied that I had sufficient facts on which to make my determination, and I'm confident in the correctness of that conclusion, I have no way of compelling that officer to be interviewed. Connecticut law should be reconsidered to provide prosecutors with an effective mechanism that enables us to interview uncooperative witnesses at the investigative stage. We stand virtually alone in the nation in this regard, and my fear is that the next prosecutor investigating one of these incidents will be unable to thoroughly investigate because of this deficiency in Connecticut law. Finally, I've written in the past about incidents of individuals experiencing mental health crises being shot by police. In this case, Mr. Gendron's looming eviction was a cause of great emotional distress for him. He was about to be thrown out of a home he lived in for more than 2 decades. The judicial branch should recognize that eviction and foreclosure proceedings have the potential to take a heavy emotional toll on the individuals involved. At the very least, they might consider publicizing the mental health and housing resources that are available to individuals confronting the loss of their homes. Lastly, I'd like to acknowledge the invaluable assistance of the Connecticut State Police Central District Major Crime Squad, and in particular Sergeant Ralph Soda and Detective Lindsay Valcourt. It would quite simply be impossible for us to do this work without the dedication and professionalism of the men and women serving on the 3 major crime squads of the state police. Now, Chief State's Attorney Richard Colangelo.
Thank you, Brian. Just briefly, ladies and gentlemen, and if you look at the division's testimony with regard to the police accountability bill, you'll note that State Attorney Preleski highlighted several of the things that we talked about. You know, it is incumbent on, if the legislature is going to create an office of Inspector General, and that's done through the Division of Criminal Justice by our proposal, another deputy chief, that person have the ability to investigate these cases thoroughly. And that thoroughness would entail them having the ability to subpoena witnesses to come in and testify, to give information with regard to these instances. The other major takeaway from State Attorney Preleski's report is obviously body cameras. Right? There were no body cameras in Waterbury Police Department in this incident. I know the legislature is talking about making them mandatory for all police departments. That's a great first step, but if we're not utilizing the technology that State Attorney Preleski talked about, then we're still going to be running into the issue of police officers not arming their body cameras or turning them on in that instant where we really need that testimony, that footage to show what really happened. So that was really the end of my statement. I don't know if anybody has any questions briefly for Brian or I.
What reason, if any, did the other Waterbury officer give for not agreeing to be interviewed?
There was no reason provided. And you have to understand that in Connecticut, we do not have an effective grand jury system. So for instance, in federal court, they do. It's an investigating grand jury. Nor do we have the ability to subpoena witnesses in the investigative stage. There's no reason given.
So you guys, just wanted to spell it out. Are you asking again for an investigative subpoena power? I mean, that's been a consistent position of this office for years now.
Honestly, if you look at our testimony for the public accountability or police accountability, right, that really, we're talking about just the ability to have investigative subpoenas for this type of crime, for that particular deputy chief that would be, the Inspector General position that the legislature is talking about implementing.
Have you heard anything back from the leadership of that committee or the leadership of the legislature regarding that task or that recommendation?
We have not.
When it comes to the body camera issue, I know police departments have said it's pretty cost prohibitive, not just the body cameras themselves, but then the storage being a whole other issue. I mean, do you think the state and the federal government need to step up to provide funding for these local departments?
Sure, there's a cost associated with it, and the better the technology, the higher the cost. So there's an additional cost associated, for instance, with the smart holster technology that will automatically turn on the body cameras when the officer draws his firearm. There's an additional cost associated with some of the technology associated with dash cameras. For instance, they will go on when lights and sirens are activated in the car, but there are also options to have them go on when the cruiser reaches a certain speed, to have them automatically activated. Automatic downloads when you head back to the police department. So there is a cost associated with it. If the state is going to mandate it, there should be, in my view, some degree of support for municipalities in terms of that cost. And I can tell you that in my conversations with the chief in Waterbury, that was one of the things that he mentioned was the cost of these things. We do have a lot of cash-strapped cities, and we do have a lot of very small departments in places like, in my jurisdiction, Plymouth, that is a small department serving a community that is not a terrifically affluent community. So there is a cost associated with it, but the question that we have to answer is really how much is too much for us to have the best evidence that we can get in these cases.
On the incident itself, I did just want to, there's someone who may read that and say, this was a disabled individual, why couldn't the officer physically overpower him without discharging his weapon, or maybe even use a taser? Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I think you can take a look. What I did in the report that all of you have is I provided you with the entirety of Officer Tompkins' statement, and Officer Tompkins addresses that in his statement.
What does he say? Just, can you
Well,
paraphrase it, or?
yeah, so I didn't paraphrase his statement in the report. I provided the entirety of it in the report because I didn't actually want to be accused of paraphrasing it and paraphrasing it inaccurately.
What happens with Officer Tompkins now?
Officer Tompkins was on administrative duty. What happens next vis-a-vis Officer Tompkins would be a question that you'd have to direct to the Waterbury Police Department.
Are there other investigations in which investigative subpoena power would be helpful for state's attorneys other than police matters?
Well, and I note this in the report, the division has consistently sought the ability to do that for more than 2 decades. Yeah, there are a whole range of investigations where that would assist us in things like political corruption and any type of investigation where you have a witness who simply doesn't wish to cooperate with the investigation.
And these are 3 pretty concrete takeaways that you outlined, but are there next steps that you can or will take to make those recommendations a reality?
Just working with the legislature to see if they could, if they're willing to enact them, honestly.
And to be clear, we're just talking about police investigations with subpoena power, so in theory, the Inspector General, not municipal corruption investigative subpoena power, but the rest of the state's attorneys?
If you read our testimony, that is pretty clear, so if you have an issue reading that, just let us know.
The toxicology report does show that he was on like methamphetamine. Is that something that could make someone stronger than they are in reality?
Yeah, that's something you'd really have to talk to an expert about. That's offered in the report in part because the fact that he did have some drugs in his system and some alcohol in his system may explain in part why he had this reaction to Officer Tompkins coming in that morning.
Can you tell us how many pending investigations of police-involved deaths or shootings there are?
It's published on the division's website, and the website, in addition to that, has the latest status reports in connection with each of those.
Okay, but I mean, I'm asking cases that are pending. Is that listed?
Mhm.
It is,
Okay,
yes.
okay.
Yes.
I
Yep.
hadn't looked at it, thank you.
Do you know if there was any internal discipline when it comes to Officer Tompkins?
I don't know.
Thanks, everybody.